Hey everyone, welcome to the preview for this Sunday's Sunday school class. We're continuing our study in Paul's letter to the Philippians. Today we're going to finish chapter 2, looking at verses 19 to 30. 19 to 30 is a passage that gets pretty personal. Paul talks about two important people, two individuals, Timothy and Epaphroditus, who have been serving Paul and both Paul and the church at Philippi in unique ways. With Timothy and Epaphroditus, we see examples of the kind of service and commitment that Paul has been urging us to do as we seek to follow Christ, and what he's been speaking to about service and unity and Christ-likeness. He now brings forth two examples of this with Timothy and Epaphroditus. So you have an example of Jesus Christ, big example, right? But then you also have two very common or ordinary examples of real people. And so Paul doesn't want to just leave the Philippians thinking like, oh, I have to be just like Jesus to be of any value in the church. No, far from it. Here is Timothy and Epaphroditus. And I think it's important for us to take from this passage the understanding that one of the most important ways that God mediates his grace to us is in our lives with each other. And we know that our lives are shaped by reading and listening to the scriptures. We know the importance of prayer in our lives to shape and mold us in Christ-like faith. But if we're really honest with ourselves, most of us would recognize that perhaps the most profound influence we've had as Christians have been the lives of other Christians in our own lives. So this is one of the reasons why Paul is so often urging the churches to love and serve one another, because it is in that context that you see the grace of God being put forward. And so in bringing up Timothy and Epaphroditus, Paul is sort of giving flesh and bone to the idea of the service that he has been talking about. So in 19 to 30, Paul gives us this example of selfless conduct to which he's calling the Philippian church. And here are men worthy of the gospel of Christ, just as he has told them. So I'll let you go ahead and read the passage, and let's move to our first slide. So one of the first things I want to point out is notice how Paul sort of sandwiches his words about Timothy with statements of hope, right? Paul remains uncertain, although he's optimistic, but he remains uncertain. He doesn't have a crystal ball, and even though he's optimistic about the future, he knows that his life is in the Lord's hands, and he knows that things may go bad for him and that he might need Timothy at his side more than ever. And the thing to remember is, just like today, staying in prison wasn't free. You had to pay for your stay, and furthermore, that pay didn't go for food or clothes or bedding. You also needed someone outside to provide those things, and that's why we still use the word languish to describe someone who's left alone in prison. That's a word that describes abandonment. And it may be the case that Paul is feeling a little bit abandoned apart from Timothy and Epaphroditus. Let me try to paint sort of a picture of what may be the background to all of this, or what maybe a more likely scenario behind this. So, what we believe is that the Philippians have heard about Paul's imprisonment, and then to assist their friend and apostle, they send Epaphroditus with a gift for Paul. Most likely, it's a substantial sum of money to help Paul pay for his expenses. And we know from other stories that it was customary for a church to send a small group of people when traveling with money. This provides greater protection while on the road. It keeps the money bearer accountable so that they don't skim off the top. And while Epaphroditus was traveling with money, or perhaps once he arrived in Rome, he became deathly sick. And some member of the party went back to Philippi to tell everyone about Epaphroditus. So they also became concerned for his health as well. The money got to Paul, and Epaphroditus was able to heal from his illness and also provide news to Paul about the issues facing the church at Philippi. Paul is now sending Epaphroditus back to Philippi with this letter. And in this letter, he now tells the Philippians that he hopes to send Timothy to them to get a report of their doings that will please him. Now, by saying that he hopes to be cheered by what they can get from Timothy, or by what he can get from Timothy, he's subtly implying that he expects them to receive his letter and start putting into practice the things that he's teaching them. And this is sort of a clever statement of Paul. It conveys a message of Paul's expectations upon them, but not in a threatening way, but rather more in a unifying way. Paul wants their obedience to be genuine, and he wants to hear from them and receive joy that they are heeding his word and working together. From what we read here, it looks like Timothy may have been the only one helping Paul in his situation. Paul says there's no one like him. But not only is Paul likely one of the few who are there to help Paul, Paul knows that Timothy is about the only one whom he could trust to send to Philippi, who shared Paul's heart for them as well. In verse 20, he says, "For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare." We know that Timothy was with Paul when he first went to Philippi in Acts 16. Timothy was present when Lydia was converted and her whole household was baptized. And while Timothy wasn't in the Philippian prison with Paul and Silas, it's very likely that Timothy would have served them while they were there, and it may have even been the case that Timothy served something as a liaison between Paul and the city magistrates in Acts 16. Timothy is like a son to Paul, and he has proven his worth time and time again, and his worth is proven, we might say here, or it says here. He's been tested, and he is shown to be the genuine article. In verse 21, we also learn a little bit more about Paul's situation. He writes, "For they all seek their own interest and not those of Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel." Now, the question we might want to ask is, who are the they in this verse? Well, it's probably those in the Church of Rome whom Paul might hope to call upon for a similar task. This may be the folks. This may be the folks in view back in chapter 1 when he spoke of people preaching Christ with selfish motives. And Paul may be feeling somewhat abandoned by the local church in Rome. That would be a sad testimony about the church, but many of us can think of examples where the church has let us down. This should be a warning to all churches, and so it should be a warning to us as well. A church turned inward on itself will bear the fruit of its selfishness, and it will end up doing more harm than good. Now, of course, we don't know the exact situation here, but it seems pretty clear that Paul sees everyone but Timothy as sort of having abandoned him. Of course, this isn't including Epaphroditus, whom he plans to send to Philippi. Finally, Paul hints again at the possibility of seeing them himself, but he rightly frames it in the larger scope of his trusting in the Lord for his future. Paul then goes on to commend Epaphroditus. He describes him as his brother, his co-worker, his fellow soldier. And it's interesting that Paul uses the word soldier here. Remember how Paul used military imagery at the end of chapter 1 to describe their unity and purpose in the mission as a church in the world? In calling Epaphroditus a fellow soldier, I think Paul is picking up on that imagery once again to tell the Philippians that here is an example of what I'm talking about. Here is someone you can learn from. Here is someone whom you can look to in order to grow in your faith and service as a child of God. Later in verse 29, he will tell the church to hold men such as Epaphroditus in high regard, honor them, be aware of their worth and value to you in the Lord. Now, as we noted, Epaphroditus had taken ill, and Paul wants to point out that even in this life-threatening illness, his thoughts and concerns were with the Philippians. Paul expresses his great love for Epaphroditus by saying that the money that was granted to him in order to recover, the mercy that was granted to him in order to recover from his illness was no less a mercy of God himself. Now, here too, Paul isn't just simply laying out platitudes in order to make Epaphroditus look good. He's showing the Philippians just how important other people are in our shared life in Christ. If Epaphroditus can be this important for Paul, think of how important he can be to the church in Philippi. One wonders if Epaphroditus may not have been as highly esteemed by the Philippians before he left Rome. Of course, they were very concerned about him, but maybe he was just someone who was able to get the job done that was needed. He was there to serve, but nothing else. We have in our church every week people who do works of service to make sure the worship service flows well, make sure the children are provided and cared for in nursery and Sunday school, make sure the lights are turned off at the end of the service when we all go home, make sure the offering is counted and checked, and there's accountability there with what's brought in and where it goes. There are a lot of areas of service in the church and through the church. And so I think a lesson that we can draw from here is that there, as Francis Schaeffer used to say, there is no such thing as tiny Christians. There are no small people in the gospel of Jesus Christ and in the church. Continuing on, Paul wants the church in Philippi to honor people like Epaphroditus, not because he was heroic and honorable in the eyes of the world, but because he was like Christ. Interestingly, here Paul makes this very clear in the Greek, because the phrase that tells us that Epaphroditus nearly died in verse 30 is exactly the same as the phrase in 2:8, which describes Christ as coming to the point of death. Epaphroditus' near death for Paul echoes Christ's real death for us. This young man had the mind of Christ. Epaphroditus' work might not seem like a lot, but it played a crucial role. Note, Paul says that he is risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. Now, by saying that they were lacking, Paul isn't offering them a backhanded compliment. Paul wasn't downplaying everything they had so far done for him. Rather, he's lifting up Epaphroditus to say essentially that he's the piece of the puzzle that puts everything together. Without the service and the suffering of Epaphroditus, the joint mission of the church in Philippi to minister to Paul simply wouldn't have happened. It would have all fallen through. Again, there are no little people in the church of God. God has called us to love and serve and be a light in the world. God isn't asking for heroes and great people who can stand in the spotlight. He's looking for faithfulness. And from where you are, for in faithfulness there is true greatness, true joy, and true delight. Well, I look forward to spending time on Sunday together as we go over this passage, and we'll see you then.